And I was there for pretty much all the consultations with my husband, except obviously when he was in hospital, and I don't know what conversations he might have had with the doctors, but I don't ever remember anybody offering him psychological support at all. And as it happens, I don't think he would have taken it in any case, because you talking about catheters reminds me, and trying to lighten this up a little bit. We managed to do a number of holidays, but the last one we did was to go to New York in the November of 2007, just at the beginning of December. And he'd actually got a catheter in, a permanent one, at that time. And he managed to do that with this blooming thing in. But it's another world. Mm. But I think that is something that perhaps maybe should be thought about a little bit more for guys, is that support. Because, what he had to have done... he obviously was a very strong person, but not everybody's going to be able to cope without that support. So maybe that was another little bit of a dip in the sort of, not the treatment, because you treat the condition, but the looking
journey.
At the whole person.
It's a journey.
It's this, not just that all the time as well.
I think it's often overlooked, isn't it? The mental and emotional effects.
It gets so focused on what
on
treatment is needed. By the time my husband had had his initial surgery, then the 3 months wait, the first PSA test, it was down from 79 to 4.1. Well, it was still raised, but it was a hell of a lot better. Okay, jubilation. We were, really buoyed up by this. He then went off to his beloved motor racing to Le Mans, and he was back in hospital in the July because the cancer was the prostate. It had grown again, it had closed over the urethra, he couldn't wee properly, his kidneys were becoming dilated, and that was only found out by chance that he went back himself because he just felt heavy and he wasn't flowing properly. So in the time period of that, obviously again, the fear comes back because it's all back there, there's more concerns. And that was at the time that they then drew us into the oncology as well as the urology people. Still at this stage, no mention of the fact that it was likely to be terminal, but, I was frightened. And with Bob he never disclosed it. He just kept fight all the time. So I tried to match him in that. And I remember going to see the oncologist on the 8th of August 2008, and I did get tearful. I tried very, very hard not to. But the humanity of that individual, it was a lady, could have been a guy, but she said, I always seem to be making people cry. And I said to her, no, it's not you. Don't ever think it's you. It's what you have to deal with in order to try and help us. But it just bowled on so quickly. And he had radiotherapy initially to the prostate, 7 sessions of that. But it still wasn't enough to hold it back. And then he started getting pain in the back of the pelvis, so they gave him another shot for radiotherapy, which did help that. Then it was in the thigh, and then it was into chemotherapy the following year. And that was pretty exhausting for him, and still they couldn't hold it back. But through all of that, those staff were so supportive and so encouraging.
Describe wonderfully how you've supported Bob. And I just was wondering, where in the system was there support for you as the supporter of Bob through this? The kind of it's often really called the support for carers, which is
there wasn't.
I wondered.
I don't think I realised how much went into it until it was actually said in the August of 2008, because he'd had to go back in again because the cancer had closed up the urethra for the second time, so they did another reaming out. By that time his kidneys were so severely dilated, when we did actually have to go back, because we had one Tuesday afternoon, because by that time you're working with 2 groups of people, you've got urology and oncology. And the oncology nurse specialist, I'd been talking to her because Bob was beginning to have double vision. And at that time, the oncology specialist was away. And so the lady said, come down and I'll fit you in before you go to the urology people. And she said, it sounds as if you've got a tumour in your head. And I'll arrange an MRI, etc., and get that all organised so, you come away from that a bit sort of. So we then went to the urology people because of the fact that he couldn't wee properly again. And there was the first time I actually felt that it wasn't handled very well.
Right.
Because the specialist there, I'm sorry to say a man, we hardly got into the room and he just bowled out, because bear in mind at this stage we still hadn't been told that it was terminal. He just said, oh, well, you're more likely to die of kidney failure than you are of cancer. And whilst, both of us had our suspicions, it wasn't exactly the nicest way to deal with it. And I would urge specialists to look at notes and try and, I know they're busy people, but to get a feel for what's been going on in a patient's life and the life of their carer, and just try and, couch that slightly differently. It was a bit like being hit with an axe, yes. To have your worst fears confirmed in that way. And then later on, when the MRI scan was done, that confirmed, because my husband Bob had a fit as well, and that then confirmed that it was in his head, and that was the time when the oncologist had the job of telling us that it was terminal, and she did do that very well. We got my two stepdaughters, their partners together, and she had to come from another hospital, and it was quite late in the evening that she came and saw us, and she was very good. But again, that's when they said also about the Macmillan and support from that. But I think, thankfully we were a strong family and we managed to sort of hold it together.
Do you know what you would have liked for you in terms of support through that very difficult?
I think just the acknowledgement that the Macmillan were there, but they're so busy, they don't, they can only give you a little bit of time, and they came in still further down through our experience, and it was all moving so fast, there wasn't time to build relationships. I think probably for me, a bit more help after the death might have been helpful. There was help, but I didn't feel that it was too thin. It wasn't specialised enough to deal with the depth of the emotion. And basically, I suppose I've sorted it out myself to wherever I am now. I did take some private counselling earlier this year because it just took my whole confidence away that first year. But
it sounds like it would have been helpful to have had that built in. Or more
it would have been
available,
helpful,
yeah.
but to be honest, I wanted to be there. I didn't want to waste a moment away from Bob. I don't know whether I would have even allowed myself to do it, because I just needed to be there to keep supporting him.
Sometimes you need to just be. And then you'll know when the time's right that you need that support.
That's right.
And you knew it was more important to be with your husband at that moment in time.
Yeah, I just felt that we had to make the most of every moment that we had got. And the other point where I did feel that the medical professionals did not handle it as well as they might have done. Once effectively we were discharged from the care of the hospital, there was no explanation as to whose care we then went back under. And because one of the nurse urology specialists had been in at the beginning of this whole experience, had then moved into being a Macmillan nurse with our local hospice, I gravitated towards her, and I did use the hospice as a contact, and we had the home care team became part of our lives for as long as it was appropriate for my husband to stay at home, for Bob to stay where he wanted to be. But then, of course, what wasn't explained is that it's not solely a home care team. You have district nurse input, which brings the GP back in. And I did have a bumpy ride with my GP at that time. He never once he never examined my husband, he never saw anything of what the situation was like, and my husband's tumour was visual, and it was grim. He just kept saying to me, "Are you all right? Are you depressed?" And all right, I would cry, but I wasn't depressed, and all he wanted to do was give me pills. And he made a home visit and almost ignored my husband and kept on at me about wanting to give me medication. And I said, "Look, I haven't got time. I need every wit that I've got to keep on top of this." And we actually fell out. I got so pissed off with him that I just said to him, "Go. You are not listening to what I'm saying. You are not helping me. Go." And that's, it was at that time that really it got a bit tricky.
But it sounds like your contact with the hospice at that stage
That was crucial.
important. Yeah.
Because it's always at night, isn't it, that you need somebody. So you ring. They did tell us, you phone the hospice. Well, they can only do a certain amount, but then you've got to phone the duty doctors, and that takes ages. Then you've got to tell the story to every duty doctor, so they've got the scene set for them. And I don't know how they get over that. I really don't, because you can't expect a duty doctor to sit down and read the notes of every single person who rings up and who they go and visit. It feels as if that's what ought to happen, but it isn't going to happen. It's not realistic. But that's, for me, is where things could be improved. Make it clear to people who are leaving a hospital who their lines of communication are, because you need it. You really do need it. It is quite frightening when someone is in so much pain that what you've got to hand is not doing anything, and you need to know.
It sounds like in all of the stories there's something important about having someone that you can have a real relationship with, in terms of there's someone in the kind of that you're in contact with, that you trust, that knows you, that supports your decision.
Well, in my particular case, because Bob was offered radiotherapy to his head to try and shrink the tumour, and again, I can't thank the oncologist enough for doing that. She didn't have to do it. She'd already told us it was terminal. She didn't have to offer that. It took a bit longer to get to us than I would have chosen, and it did bring Bob back to us to some extent, because there were times when this thing in his head, he knew what he wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come out right. Oranges and lemons and pips were things and he was trying to tell me, have I had my medication? So you learn to read a sort of second language. And then of course you get all extra symptoms like that, which I didn't know was going on. And the person who really began to straighten that mess out was one of the doctors from our local hospice. And she was just like a breath of fresh air. She walked in, this calm, serene person. And she, for that time, actually looked at Bob as a whole person. And it made such a difference. And she was so, caring, but professional. You knew that you could trust her to do everything. And right towards the very end, she got all the drugs necessary in, all the necessary needles, so that if I had to call a doctor in the night, everything was there. Our middle bedroom looked like a blinking dispensary at one stage. But at least it gave a feeling of comfort that when you got help, they've got something to use. And it wasn't a case of, well, we haven't got what we need, so then you've got more time, etc. But those are the weak links. The change from coming from hospital care into palliative care. Who do you lean on? Explain that it's not solely the palliative, that the GP and the district nurses are involved as well. But I just felt in our case there was some friction, and we were the ones I felt that had to fight hard to get the clarity.